Hello everybody, welcome back to our new show, News from a World in Flux. I'm Clare Farrell, I'm a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. I'm joined by Dr Charlie Gardner, conservation scientist, and we're hosting a series of short discussions to help bring to the surface things that we think need a lot more attention, news that's not on the news, things that sometimes seem quite complicated but we think are totally possible for the everyday person to understand. And hopefully some of what we're bringing is useful for people within our movements to be able to share with people outside the movement so they can understand what we're worrying about, and so that they can get their eyes on reports and information as it unfolds, things that really should deserve a lot more attention than what they receive in mainstream media. And so, Charlie, first thing we're going to talk about today is going to be aerosol masking, which is probably quite a weird term that most people haven't heard, I would say. And then we'll move on and talk a little bit about economics and pensions. And there's been a relatively recent report about the economics that people are applying to climate policy, and particularly looking at the pension system from a group called Carbon Tracker. So first of all, Charlie, let's do the science bit, which is aerosol masking. Do you want to, why is it on our agenda, basically, right, today?
Okay, so we've had just this extraordinary sequence of really extreme weather events all around the world going on for months now. We talked about this a bit in the last episode. And one of the most extreme climate-related events that's going on right now and has been over recent months is this marine heat wave. The waters in the North Atlantic have been mind-blowingly hot. They broke the record by over a degree, which is a huge leap over an existing record, right? So it's really hot. Around Florida, in late July, the water was the same temperature as a bath, right? It was that hot, and it's killing all the corals. Wow. So there's been a lot of discussion about why the oceans have suddenly got so hot, and it's a real problem because the oceans absorb a lot of the heat as our planet heats up, and previously the oceans absorbing all this heat has acted as a bit of a brake to climate change because the heat isn't staying in the atmosphere, it's going into the oceans. But now the oceans are heating up, so people are going, what's going on? How could it have got so hot so fast? And it seems a part of the answer, at least, is to do with aerosols. So when we burn stuff, fossil fuels, trees, whatever, it gives off greenhouse gases. And as we know, greenhouse gases heat the atmosphere, they cause the greenhouse effect, everything gets warmer. But as well as the greenhouse gases, the smoke from burning stuff also contains aerosols, tiny particles. And some of these can have a cooling effect on the planet because they reflect sunlight. So these particles in the air, they reflect the solar radiation back. So they act as a mask. So the planet is heating up, but it's not heating up as much as it would otherwise because we're also releasing these aerosol particles.
Because of the pollution.
Because
so
of the pollution.
Pollution cools it and warms it.
And this is really
confusing, isn't it?
It's really confusing because aerosols are bad, right? They're really bad for human health. We hear these figures occasionally of the vast numbers of people, in the millions of people that die from air pollution every year, and this is because of aerosols. So aerosols are bad for our health. They also cause some of them cause acid rain. However, they do have this masking effect, which is turning out to be really important. So this isn't new. So we've known about the risk of losing this masking effect as we decarbonise for a long time. You might remember from the last IPCC reports, it said very clearly in the second paragraph of the report, since the Industrial Revolution, the planet has heated on average, we've released greenhouse gases which have heated the planet on average by X amount, I can't remember the precise figure, but we have also released aerosols that have cooled the planet by somewhere between 0 and 0.8 degrees. So it's known about.
And that is a big window, right? When people go, every fraction of a degree really matters. It's like, we've got a problem it might be this small, but it might be this big, and we don't know which one it is, which in my experience anyway of knowing this has been a long running like question in our space, like why is no one talking about it, how bad is it, and I've been like told a lot of the time by people who are like experts in science or experts in communications that actually what we do know is bad enough. There dear, just don't go on about it because we don't know the answer. But if the risk is like potentially this big, it's just another one, isn't it? In the whole, there's a whole series of things like this in the climate space, but it's yet another one where you kind of go from it might be a problem to oh fuck, right?
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Because the uncertainty is so large, our reaction in the scientific community is to say, oh, we can't really talk about this because we're not sure. Whereas the reaction should be, oh fuck, this is a big problem. We need to talk about it and we need to act so we can decrease the uncertainty, so we can do more about it. So anyway, sulfur aerosols, sulfur dioxide aerosols are really, really important for this masking effect, right? And shipping fuel used to be really full of had really, really high sulfur content because there's no people in the ocean, so you can use dirty fuel, it doesn't matter. But then in 2020, the International Maritime Organization lowered their limits for sulfur emissions. And this has caused a big reduction in sulfur aerosol emissions from shipping. And this is really important because so these aerosols, they work in two ways. One is the direct sunlight reflection, but the other thing is that these tiny particles act as seeds around which rain droplets forms. So they stimulate cloud formation, basically. And clouds, as we know, they're white, they're really reflective. So when you have lots of clouds over the ocean, solar radiation gets reflected back. When they're not there, it gets absorbed by the ocean. So you can look at satellite imagery, and until 2020, when you look at the satellite imagery, you can see these really, really clear lines of clouds in the ocean. They're called ship tracks. And this is basically because of the sulfur emissions of these ships. Since the IMO put in place their legislation, these ship tracks are disappearing basically because there's no sulfur, there's no clouds being formed. So this is, the science here is very, very clear. There's no controversy about this aerosol masking, the existence of the phenomenon. The controversy is, as you said, it's about the levels of uncertainty. So some people right now are saying all of this marine heatwave is entirely down to the loss of this masking effect. They call it termination shock, the shock of losing this masking effect. Other people are saying, yes, it is an issue, but it's probably not causing all of this global marine heatwave because there's other things going on too. We're entering an El Nino, which perhaps we'll talk about another time, but it means we have much hotter years. There's been an absence, an unusual absence of dust from the Sahara over the Atlantic. So that dust also reflects sunlight, and that's not happening. And then there was also a volcano in Tonga a couple of years ago, which has put lots and lots of water vapor really high in the atmosphere, and that might be having an effect. So there's lots of things that might be going on. But we do know aerosol masking is an issue. But it's a really, really difficult issue to solve because, because as we said before, these aerosols are bad. They're shockingly bad for human health. And they are also, there's no avoiding the fact that decarbonisation means putting less and less of these aerosols into the air. So there's no easy answers, but I think the most obvious first step is to acknowledge the issue, and that's not really being done outside of really niche climate science circles. So it's a worrying situation. It's an interesting situation, but it's also possibly a situation we can learn from, because in effect what we've been inadvertently doing has been running a sort of natural experiment on geoengineering. And increasingly people talk about needing to do geoengineering as a way of avoiding the worst climate impacts. And yeah, most of us in the climate movement were always very, very wary of this. One reason is that it could have, the law of unintended consequences. You do something and you don't know what the unintended consequences might be. And in fact, this whole issue with the sulfur emissions masking is a great example of the law of unintended consequences. The IMO said we're doing a good thing by stopping sulfur, but actually other things happened. So geoengineering is really, really a horrifying prospect for that reason. It's also a horrifying prospect because just as we've seen with carbon capture technology, just this idea that in the future we might have technologies that will help with the problem is always used as an excuse to stop dealing with the problem now. And of course, we have to start dealing with the problem now. So geoengineering is a real risk, but nevertheless, it would be silly not to learn from this natural experiment in geoengineering that's been happening.
And we are doing it already. That's my problem with the geoengineering debate. Is people go, "Oh, we should never ever do that," and it's like we're already doing it. Like
releasing fossil fuels into the atmosphere is geoengineering.
Doing it. Yeah. And other people that I've spoken to said, deforestation was a form of geoengineering, the way that human beings have done it all over the world. I mean, the vast loss of forest all over the planet, it's been immense, hasn't it? For the last, I don't know how many hundreds of
thousands,
years. So it changes the air, the cloud cover, it affects then the weather, then you have different cloud. It feels very clear to me that we're already quite deep in geoengineering scenario
I strongly
we've
agree
made
with
ourselves.
That, absolutely. I think one of the big risks of geoengineering is that it will be done in an unstructured and ungoverned way. There are lots of different nations on this planet. They're all suffering differently from climate change. There are lots of different corporations, rich individuals, and because geoengineering could potentially be so simple. So one form of geoengineering is what's called cloud brightening, which is a bit like recreating these ship tracks that we've lost from sulfur. But basically, you put lots of boats in the ocean, they spray salt water into the air, that forms clouds. The risk of geoengineering is that individual actors could just say, right, I'm going to do this now. And
well, there are already laws, aren't there, about not deploying technology to change the weather. I mean, you know that there are places in the world where governments have sought to create clear skies, for example, for the purposes of having a good event on a day. They don't want that to happen, or they do want the rain to happen. People do already know how to change their weather by interfering, don't they, with the makeup of the sort of local atmosphere. And so it's understood that, if you do that in one place and it makes your country get the rain and then the other country next door doesn't get the rain because of what you've done and they therefore have a massive water problem, we can see how geopolitically, not just doing this to sort of affect the climate, big picture, but also doing it to get relief, let's say, from a lack of rain or whatever, is going to be potentially something that could get very nasty internationally, couldn't it, without people being able to coordinate properly. And it's obvious from climate negotiations for the last 30 years that we are not capable of making these negotiations go well at the moment. We really do need some fresh approaches, don't we, to how to have these discussions about our interconnected, we're all in this big risk together, and it is one planet.
Yeah. So I do agree that we need to think about how to have these negotiations in a new way. But what's key is that we do have these negotiations, that we do try and coordinate and make sure that if these experiments are being run, that they're being run in a way where there is some oversight. and there's some coordination. So this is just going to become a bigger and bigger and bigger issue. And of course, yeah, we talked about it being a potential distraction. And of course, you know, nothing that we've said about the aerosol masking or anything else detracts from the importance of stopping using fossil fuels and decarbonising as much as possible. Yes, aerosol masking or the loss of aerosol masking has an effect, but it's tiny compared to the effect of the greenhouse gases themselves. So let's get distracted here. This doesn't mean we need to rethink fossil fuels or anything like that. Absolutely, the main thing we need to do very, very quickly is end the fossil fuel era and stop destroying nature. But nevertheless, we also need to be thinking ahead and putting in place, you know, governance structures that will allow us to have these really difficult decisions as a global community in the future.
And it feels to me like there's so much uncertainty about what could happen. I know there was a planned experiment that was, I think, stopped by the Sami people who objected to it and said, no, you're not doing that over our territory or whatever, over our heads. We haven't consented to this. We don't want this to happen. And obviously, I mean, I had some of this conversation before with a guy called Ye Tao, who's got this project about mirrors and replacing reflective capacity on the surface of the Earth. And, you know, his work on looking at what could be done to intervene in this whole Earth system sense is, I think, really looking at ways that you could engage in this with being minded to make sure that the things that you're studying are like the most benign possibilities or the most reversible possibilities. It seems to me that there's some conversations in this area which are about doing an experiment, which, as you said, you just throw something into the atmosphere and go, let's see what happens then. And there's no way of getting it back. Whereas talking with him about, you know, if you did roll out lots and lots of mirrors in a place, well, you can just take them down again. If you don't like what they've, if you don't like the impact, you could take them back down. And I feel like there's a need for the climate movement and for the political discourse more broadly to very quickly upskill itself, right, in how to think about these issues, how to take science far more seriously than what we've seen in the mainstream, you know, distortion and like just the joke of the conversation about, oh, is the climate real? Let's have an argument about that. You know, we really need to like do a leapfrog over like where people have a lot of catching up to do in terms of understanding the science to get to this point where you can have a proper debate about this issue, because it's so complicated. It feels like we're far behind, and there's a sort of ethical debate around this, as much as there is a geopolitical one, as much as there is a scientific one, as much as there is an economic one, whatever. It's sort of, you know, but there's a problem here of like ethics, isn't there, really?
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. So you said, you pointed out how far behind the curve we are, and how we're not really thinking beyond. We're being reactive, not proactive, I guess is how what I'm saying it. And we see that across all sectors of society. But we've seen a particularly shocking example recently of just how far behind the curve the finance industry is. So tell us about that carbon tracker report.
So yeah, there's carbon tracker report that's come out, basically massively underestimating the risks of climate and the costs. It's interesting to see that like one of the key contributors to this appears to be a guy called Steve Keen. For anyone who doesn't know who he is, he's an economist. For a long time, when I read this, I thought, oh, that's not news. You know, it was sort of all over the thing. This is new thing. This opinion that's been brought forward by Steve isn't news. He's been saying it for a very long time. Actually, when you look at the economics work that was done, which we might remember from, I don't know if it's like pre the Paris Agreement, I think, but where a guy called Nordhaus and others led economics work for the IPCC, which basically said, it would be better for the economy if we went to 3+ degrees of global warming, and completely misused, misread. I don't know whether it was on purpose or not, but basically used science to back that up without actually collaborating with the scientists properly. Yeah. Go on.
But just to say, it was based on just really, really extraordinary assumptions that just don't hold any water. That just even anyone that doesn't know anything about climate change can see that this doesn't make sense. So one of Nordhaus's key assumptions, he said, right, almost all economic activity takes place indoors, therefore climate change isn't a problem. So basically he said, all economic activity that does take place indoors won't be affected. And
is that because he thought that climate was weather as well? Is that if you're in a building you're going to be all right? So
I don't know. I guess it was, but he just as you said, his estimates of the economic cost of climate change were just extraordinary. He was talking about a few % decline in GDP with a 3-degree world. I think they even talked about a 7-degree world.
I'm looking at it here. Even with a 5 to 7 degrees of global warming, economic growth will continue.
It's just the most it's literally the most nonsensical thing I've ever heard. There will be no economy. People are talking about the very real risk of society collapsing in a 2-degree world. In a 7-degree world, there will be no organised human society. If there are any humans at all, they really will be living in caves in a 7-degree world. The idea that the economy could just continue and just be untouched by this is just absolutely shocking. So how could this possibly be, right? How could this possibly be? Well, the way science proceeds is we have this system of peer review. I'll do my research, I'll submit it to a journal. The journal want to make sure that my work is right, so they will send it out to other experts and they will look at it. And then they'll say, change this, do a bit more analysis there, and then it gets published. All this mainstream economic work was published in economics journals, and the people that reviewed the work were other economists. So at no point was this work ever shown to a climate scientist who would have just pointed at it and laughed and said, what the fuck are you on about? That's just absolute nonsense. And it never would have got published. And yet, Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for economics. Not for something else he did, for that work there. He won the Nobel Prize for saying that climate change won't impact the economy. And this is mainstream economics. So tell us about the implications for the pensions sector, that they're thinking that there will be no impact on.
Well, this is it. It's so I think what this report is saying is, look, actually, this atrocious work has laid the foundations for a whole suite of people in the finance industries to pick that up as if that's the best available expert advice and then work from it. And so they've got, work in the pensions field that is policies and plans that are designed to say, well, this is how this portfolio is going to perform under these conditions, which are looking increasingly likely, 3-4 degrees or whatever. Let's ignore the reality of all this stuff, but just say, well, somebody gave us some information a long time ago that said it will carry on. We'll carry on having economic growth. We'll carry on being able to, continue to invest and extract money on the basis of these ongoing investments. So you see how the pension industry is obviously built on knowing that you've got reserves of things that you can get out later. So they're very, very intertwined, the pension system, with fossil fuels and heavy extractive industries, particularly with fossil fuels. And so this has a real big implication actually for the finance sector having to sort of have a look at reality rather than, their made up version of reality, which is quite often what I think Steve's point has always been. Like, there's neoclassical economics that works in like a world where you have a balance sheet that externalizes everything that doesn't suit them, and the rules are the rules, and it so-called works the way it works because you make up all these sort of reasons why you can like run magic tricks basically on a balance sheet and make it make sense. But it only works when you take it out of the real world, as when you place it back into like reality, material reality, climate reality, social reality. An awful lot of it just doesn't add up. And I know Steve is like one of the only economists that I've ever seen who's in conversation about this, obviously because it's so catastrophic, this piece of work, and the long-term impact that it's had, that I seem to remember him once doing a talk where he was like, actually, if I ever meet this guy, I'll knock him out because because it's not right. Like, it's not all right. So it's underpinned this setup, I guess, of the pension space, which is not feasible in the real world. And so I think that's what's trying to surface here, is like everything's built on like bullshit. It's not going to work. What are we going to do about that?
So obviously that's been a massive problem in contributing to climate change, that just, basically the entire finance sector just thinks everything will be fine, so there's no need to do anything. But beyond the climate impacts, I mean, it sounds like is there a risk of a crash or something? As if the pension sector does say, hang on, we need to look at this more seriously, they're going to have massive stranded assets and like things losing value, presumably. So there's a big readjustment coming.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's also a paper that came out recently from Chatham House as well, which is saying like the next kind of mega economic shock is going to come because of climate. And it feels to me that the separation between the disciplines is a massive problem here, right?
It really is.
I have noticed over the last 5 years of looking in depth at all these issues that, for example, if the scientists had eyes on the economists' work, they would have called bullshit on it. If, if there were people who actually understood physics, who had eyes on political work that's taking place, lobbying, investments, if there was more overlap between people who've got these sort of very siloed kind of discipline. And I guess that's one of the problems, right, of our current sort of situation, is people are hyper-specialised. They do lack breadth.
No one can see the bigger picture
of knowledge. Yeah. And so a lot of people are working in these kind of ways where they're not marking each other's work somehow. Yeah. And it's, cross-discipline work, I think, has become, to me, more and more clear that it's like a high priority.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it in my discipline. So, I'm a conservation scientist. I'm interested in conserving nature. And you would think that nature conservationists would be really aware of climate change and the risk that climate change poses to species. Yeah, we're talking about there being no more Amazon basin rainforest by the end of this century. You can't save species if the forests are not going to be there anymore. And yet, people in the wildlife conservation sector, the vast majority, are just not up to speed on climate change. Just like everyone else, just keep my head down and focus on what I'm doing. But so the really extraordinary thing about chatting about this neoclassical economics view that's just struck me is that those guys are presented as the grown-ups.
Yeah.
These mainstream economists, these are the sensible people in the room. You environmentalists and climate people, you're a bit hysterical. Like, stop shouting. Listen to the grown-ups. The grown-ups say everything's going to be okay. And it's just extraordinary because mainstream economics is based on magic and wishful thinking. And think about the incredible levels of scrutiny that get applied to anything anyone in the climate movement or any scientists say. As soon as we say something, thousands of people online will just be trying to tear apart everything we said to look for a tiny, tiny error. And then we have our entire world, everything about the way the world is run is entirely based on this neoclassical economics, which is made up nonsense, and nobody ever says, hang on, that's made up nonsense. You know, this idea that we could have infinite economic growth, that is the dominant organizing principle of our world. We will pursue economic growth, endless economic growth. Any child, literally any child, can tell you that that is nonsensical. And yet, we all just carry on our days, just walking along under this absolutely nonsensical system. And nobody ever says, hang on, that emperor's naked. You know, it's just crazy.
Well, I think we do all know that the emperor's naked now, don't we? And it's becoming more and more common to understand that. And, you know, a friend of mine keeps on saying to me, it's not the moment that you realise that the emperor's got no clothes. What's important is the moment that you realise that everyone else has already realised. Then you all know that you all know, if you see what I mean.
Yep.
And I guess that's what our movements are sort of for, in a way.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're really, really so important. And the Emperor's New Clothes is actually a good way to illustrate that. So what that story illustrates is a psychological phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance. And this is a real problem in our society. There was a recent piece of research which really highlighted the problem of pluralistic ignorance with regards to climate change. So they surveyed lots of Americans, and they asked them about their support for climate policies. And then they asked them what they thought how supportive other people would be about climate policies. And it turned out that most people were really supportive, but they thought that other people weren't supportive. So in other words, people that care about climate change are the majority, but we think we're the minority.
There was a similar report in the UK quite a long time ago, which was about voters and MPs. And it was the same thing. It was like the public think MPs don't care about climate, and the MPs think the public don't care about climate. So it was like, I mean, it's pre-XR, but this like lack of people seeing each other and knowing what's really going on.
So yeah, one of the reasons why this happens, the reason it happens with climate change is because we never talk about it, right? It's taboo, like, it's a difficult subject, so we don't talk about it. And because we don't hear other people talk about it, we think that no one else cares. So we think it's only us that cares. And this is why it's so important that all of us do what we can as individuals, because it shows the rest of society that it's not just you that cares, we all care. So it's like, you know, at the moment, most people in society are like the crowd watching the emperor's procession. We know that the emperor's naked, but we don't want to speak up and say the emperor's naked because no one else is. So we don't want to risk like embarrassing ourselves or something. But as soon as the child says that emperor's naked, it frees up everyone else to say, yeah, he is, you know. And that's what we can do as individuals, as climate activists, and not just as activists, but as, you know, if we have conversations at work, if we have conversations with our family, if we visibly make efforts to reduce our carbon footprints, what we're doing is we're showing to other people that we care and this is important. And I really think that by showing other people that we care, it frees other people up to care too. Because at the moment, everyone's sitting out going, I'm really worried, but no one else is worried, so I've got no one to speak about it. So I think this is the power we have. We influence other people, and it starts this process of social contagion. And of course, having conversations is a great way to do that. Pushing for change at work and pushing for change in your own lives are great ways to do that. But I think the most powerful way is to get out on the streets and engage in non-violent civil disobedience or other forms of protest, because it's an expression of acting like it's an emergency. You know, it shows people that this is really, really serious. That's why I do it as a scientist. You know, I've been, our scientific community, we've been trying to communicate this for so long, and we just get ignored because people don't think it's serious for some reason. But by stepping out, by risking arrest if needs be, it's me saying, look, everyone, this is really serious. I don't know how much more plain I can say it. So I think this is the value of getting involved, and I'd encourage you all to do that. We do have Extinction Rebellion groups all over the country and all over the world. If you only ever see Extinction Rebellion on the news, you might think that it's only about getting arrested, but there are so many roles you can play beyond that. Many of my friends in Extinction Rebellion haven't been arrested, but instead they make banners, or they write press releases, or they take care of the well-being of other members in the group. If you don't like XR, join other groups. If you're interested in transport or wildlife, all these things impact the climate crisis, and there are groups working on them. So do what you can, and we'll see you again soon.
See you next time.